Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Caitlin and I upload a whole bunch of different types of videos on this channel, mainly surrounding true crime and psychological cases, as well as a little bit of fashion and lifestyle sprinkled in where I can. Now today I'm back discussing, and I'm not gonna lie, it is an absolutely baffling case. I can't believe I hadn't heard more about it, to be honest with you, and I did a very brief search on YouTube to see if anyone else had really covered this, and I think there's literally only a couple of videos on this specific case on the internet, like on YouTube, which I just thought was really weird considering how strange it is. Now, it's definitely one of the more modern, like more recent cases that I've covered, in the sense that one of the more recent updates was literally only a few years ago, but it's just a strange one. So for today's video, we're going to be discussing the case of Joshua Maddux, who his case began off as a disappearance but then ultimately ended up in a murder case, and there are a lot of very strange details about this case in particular. I would also just like to apologise, as you can probably tell my voice is going a little bit funny. I've got a little bit of a cold, so we're just going to move straight on past that. Before we get started, I'm just going to include my usual disclaimer that I like to include at the start of all of my videos, just to let you guys know that I'm not claiming by any means to be an expert in this case, not any of the other cases I cover over on my channel. I'm simply relaying information that I'm able to find myself on the internet, and only certain things are accessible to me, so that means I may mispronounce things, leave things out, or get things wrong, and I apologise if I do. I'm not trying to harm anyone or do anyone an injustice. I'm simply only working with the information I have accessible to me. So with all that being said, we should just go ahead and get started discussing the case of Joshua Maddux. Joshua Maddux was born on the 9th of March in the year of 1990 in a place called Colorado Springs in the United States, more specifically in an area called Woodland Park, which was a very small, friendly community that boasted this big, gorgeous national park within its borders. He grew up in a household with three older siblings. Their names were Zachary, Kate and Ruth, and he attended the local Woodland Park High School to gain his education following, I think he had about 2 years of being homeschooled. Josh had a number of hobbies, including an extremely well-known love for travelling and also a talent for music. More specifically, he was a very talented guitarist. He was remembered as being extremely free-spirited and adventurous young man who loved to travel, who always created like this positive impact on everyone's lives around him. He performed well in school, and all of his peers knew him as having a big and loud and pleasant, enjoyable sense of humour. He made it very well known. He was kind of like the class joker, and everyone knew him as this big, funny character. One hugely tragic occurrence that took place in Josh's life was when he was 16 in the year of 2006, when his older brother Zachary sadly took his own life. Zachary had been struggling for a little while with a lot of mental health issues, and Josh was very close to his 18-year-old brother. Zachary had been struggling with a lot of mental health issues, and it's said that Josh and Zachary were extremely close. Zachary was the 18-year-old older brother to this young growing boy who looked up to him in a lot of senses, and so when this all occurred, it hit Josh hard. And following this event, every adult essentially in Josh's life watched him carefully. They were very aware on the potential impact that this could have had on his mental health, and so they kind of kept a very close eye on him, just as they were very aware of what could have potentially come about as a result of this tragic loss. It's said that Josh didn't really show too much of a psychological damage sort of immediately after the death of his brother, because he was such a loud, outgoing character. He kind of maintained this image, but apparently he did become ever so slightly quieter. Just everyone was aware that it did affect him and that he did care for his brother deeply. Joshua Maddux's case begins in the year of 2008 on the 8th of May, and Josh was said to have set out one morning on a walk around the local area. According to his family, this wasn't an unusual thing for him to do. Like I said, he loved the outdoors, he was very free-spirited, and so it wasn't very unusual for him to just go out on walks and just kind of come back a little while later, just having been in nature and happily enjoying himself. And so not only was this a common occurrence, but also Josh was 18 years old, and so they didn't really have, or they didn't think they had a lot to be concerned about. Now by this I mean that 18-year-olds do typically have their own social lives, they do kind of have their own schedules, as long as, you know, they think they're being safe. They are allowed to have their own lives in a lot of senses, and I think because he just left one day of his own accord on this seemingly mundane activity, his parents didn't really have any reason to think that anything could go wrong. It remains completely unknown whether Joshua had some other reason for going on that outing that day, but it was originally assumed that he left entirely of his own accord. Like I said, it was a typical thing for him to do, and it was originally believed that there was no other motivation behind it. And sadly, 18-year-old Joshua Maddux did not return home from his walk that day. And like I said, at first his family weren't overly concerned considering of how normal this was. He was very free-spirited and they seemingly didn't really have any previous reason to be concerned. The following day, Josh still hadn't returned home, and so his father decided that it was best to start ringing around all of his friends, anyone in the local area, maybe some acquaintances that he could have potentially either been out with or maybe stayed around their houses, just to see if anyone had any idea of where he'd been or if they'd seen him that morning perhaps. It's said that for a long time, Josh had shared his dream on going on this big, grand trip of a lifetime where he could travel the world and he'd just one day up and leave and go on this life-changing journey. And I imagine there must have been this thought in the back of their minds through the entirety of this, that despite it being very unusual, perhaps this is just what he did. Perhaps one day he decided to up and fulfill his lifelong dream. However, this did seem more and more unlikely when it began to dawn on them that he'd left the house without any of his belongings, without any sort of previous planning of a trip. You can't just really, in reality, up and leave and go on some trip of the world without any money, without anything with you, without any idea of where you were going. So it just began to seem more and more unlikely that this was the case. And after a few days had passed, it had begun to be taken a little bit more seriously by the local police, who had previously reported him as a missing person, but because of the circumstances of him being an adult technically, and like I keep saying, being very free-spirited and independent, they hadn't really thought that there was much they could do. So after a few days had passed, they began to potentially consider the fact that it might be something a little bit more sinister and that foul play might have been involved. But despite their best efforts, there were little to no updates or information that brought forward in Joshua Maddux's disappearance. That was until a number of years later, in the year of 2015, the owner of a cabin located less than a mile away from Josh's family home turned up his cabin one day, his own property, in the run-up to it being demolished. Essentially, the owner had owned it for a little while and he was planning on knocking it down and using the land to build a bunch of homes. I think they were planning on building like a residential estate. And amid the start of the house being demolished, when the owner entered the property to do its final checks, the owner discovered that there was actually a set of human remains stuck feet up in the chimney. Through a comparison of dental records with those of the body, they were able to confirm that the remains belonged to 18-year-old Joshua Maddux. According to the owner, the cabin had been uninhabited completely for over a decade. He'd stopped using it for 10 odd years. Before that, it was primarily used by the owner to host like parties and gambling, poker games and things like that. So it was a very public house, but then he decided to stop and it hadn't been touched for a decade. According to the owner, he would come in and check on the cabin every few months just to make sure that there'd been no break-ins and no squatters, no damages had been made. And he admitted that in a few of the more recent checks, he had noticed a very faint, not very nice smell in the area. But if you imagine you're the owner of an abandoned, derelict cabin in the middle of nowhere, you kind of wouldn't really think too much of it. I think he put it down to like rats and rodents and things. Maybe perhaps there were dead rodents in the walls or something, but since it was being demolished, he didn't look too much into it. Now, more into the specifics of how the body was discovered. The remains were found inside the chimney, as I said, but they were found in the fetal position with the feet above his head. And it was also discovered that he was wearing only a thin t-shirt. This was a thin, ribbed thermal top and nothing else. According to the pathologist that was carrying out the autopsy, it could be concluded that his death had not been linked to any form of drug, since there was no sign of any of it in his system, and whatever he'd officially died from had sadly been a very slow and likely painful process. I believe the most educated guess in this sense was that he believed that he either died as a result of dehydration or hypothermia, whichever one killed him first. Officially, the cause of death was either listed, I believe, as undetermined or an accident, and by the end of the video you'll kind of understand why some people aren't very happy with this. So, the first question that really comes up in this case is, first and foremost, how did he get inside the chimney? The most obvious explanation, I imagine, would be that he'd attempted to get inside the cabin through climbing through the top of the chimney, down the chimney, out the fireplace, and basically essentially breaking into the cabin that way. And through all this, it meant that at some point something went wrong, he got stuck and couldn't get himself free. However, this was proven to be an extremely unlikely, if not impossible, task by the owner of the cabin, who explained that on the top of the chimney, blocking the entrance basically to the outside of the chimney, he installed something called a rebar, which was essentially steel rods and mesh. It's like a box of like steel mesh that was encased in concrete, placed on top of the chimney to stop things like raccoons and just rodents from breaking in. So if this had been put in place to stop things like rodents, it seems very unlikely that a full-grown man essentially would be able to get in this way. The rain's really just picked up, so I apologise if you can hear that in the background. Therefore, the more likely point of entry for Joshua to have entered the chimney would have been from the inside of the cabin and climbing up through the fireplace. But an eerie fact that needs to be taken into consideration when discussing this sort of potential scenario, honestly this part really made me feel quite weird inside about this case, is that they discovered his clean clothes. So as I said, he was found in only a thin thermal top and nothing else. So all of his clean clothes were found neatly folded up inside the cabin in front of the fireplace, meaning that he would have either had to have taken them off himself and folded them up before entering the chimney of his own accord, or he'd entered the chimney and someone else had left them in front of the fireplace. This not only argues the unlikeliness of him entering from the top of the chimney, as I've written here, he would have had to have purposely taken off his clothes inside the cabin, gone outside of the cabin, and then entered through the chimney, which just seemed like a very unlikely and, if anything, pointless task. But it also introduces the potential scenario in which someone else was involved. But the strange occurrences in this case don't end here. Another discovery that was made had been that a big slab of stone that had initially been put in place to use as a breakfast bar inside the cabin in the kitchen had not only been moved from its place in the kitchen, but it had been propped up, so someone had carried it from the kitchen into the fireplace, propped it up against the fireplace to block the exit, or the bottom entry essentially, of the chimney. So if someone had been trying to climb down the chimney, they wouldn't have been able to get out because there was this huge bit of furniture in the way. And if someone had gone through the bottom of the chimney up, someone else would have had to have put that bit of stone in front of it after we'd already gone up there. Either way, it seems as though both entrances and exits of the chimney were blocked. So how did he get inside the chimney? And therefore, having this piece of information of the bit of slab that was blocking the fireplace entrance, it changes every considered scenario in reality. So if he had climbed in from the top of the chimney, like I said, there would have been no point of access for him. And knowing this kind of changes every considered scenario at this point. Considering the position that his remains were discovered in inside the chimney, it seems virtually impossible for him to have climbed up the chimney himself, because he was found with his legs above his head in a fetal position. So some people have kind of speculated the possible scenarios in him. I think there might have been someone suggested like the logistics of him maybe climbing up and then slipping and then trying to kick his way out but his feet getting trapped. I don't know exactly the logistics of it, because if anything it makes me feel really, really like enclosed. It makes me feel really claustrophobic to think about. I can't imagine how awful it must have been to be alive in that situation. But it just seems more unlikely for him to have climbed up himself alive to then get stuck in that position. But then because the fact of the slab blocking the bottom of the chimney, it seems more likely that someone else had put him up there. But then because of the fact of the slab blocking the exit or the bottom of the chimney, it seems more likely that someone else had been involved, and whether that meant that someone else had trapped him in there purposefully or someone else had kind of forced him up. So like I said, the easiest scenario prior to the discovery of the clothes inside the cabin would have been that he'd tried to climb down the chimney, gotten stuck and couldn't free himself, and so as a result he died from either hypothermia or dehydration because he was left in there for a long time. But then you can start to pick apart this theory in a number of ways using the information that we've just discussed. So number one, it would have proven to be extremely difficult for him to get into the chimney via the top, like I said, because of the rebar in the way, blocking it, if not an extremely impossible task. Number two, if he had entered the chimney through the top somehow, I don't know how, but if he had done somehow, how were his clothes then found inside the cabin, folded outside of the fireplace? So if he'd taken his clothes off himself while he was stuck inside the chimney, let's explore that theory, for example. So if we explored that scenario in the sense that he could have been stuck and taken the clothes off himself while he was stuck inside the chimney, it isn't unlikely. In fact, it is very common in hypothermia cases for people to report feeling extremely hot while suffering from hypothermia, and so he could have removed his clothes because he was having this bodily reaction to being suffering from hypothermia. But that meant that his clothes would have been found just directly below him because they would have fallen, as opposed to being folded up in front of the fireplace. Number three, if this had been the series of events and the breakfast bar had already been propped up against the fireplace, then still how did his clothes find a way in front of the fireplace. And all of this, in my personal opinion, so just through kind of my own research and my own judgment from this case, all of this can kind of be answered by some scenario or another pointing towards Josh not being alone. So following down this idea that Josh hadn't been alone in the cabin or around the cabin at that point, the most supported scenario appears to be that someone had either trapped him in the chimney following him entering of his own accord, either from the top or the bottom, so either they had encouraged him to go up there, and once he'd gotten stuck, actively hidden him essentially using the breakfast bar, or before he'd even gotten stuck, had placed the breakfast bar there, so essentially someone else had purposely trapped him in the chimney. And in this scenario, it seems likely that he would have taken his clothes off himself before entering the chimney, or he had been forced into the chimney after death by one or more individuals, providing a seemingly plausible explanation for the position that he was found in, since it is possible for a couple of people that would have taken quite a lot of strength, so it would have taken multiple people in all likelihood to force him up into the chimney after death in that fetal position. But with this specific scenario and theory in particular, it seems unlikely when the cause of death is revisited, because no signs of any other form of injury, no foul play really was found on the remains. So it seems unlikely that he was forced there after death, because, as I said, hypothermia or dehydration appeared to be the cause of death. So in reality, what has got to be asked in this sense is that if someone else had been in the cabin with Josh on that night and an accident had occurred in which he'd gotten stuck in the chimney, whether he'd, gone in there just to prove that he could, or on a dare or something, and he'd gotten stuck, why did this person, instead of alerting help in hopes of freeing him, then decide to leave him trapped? Whether they moved the breakfast bar or not, he was trapped there and someone else knew about it. And unfortunately, as morbid and disturbing as this particular scenario is, it is my personal inclination to go along the lines of someone else being involved, some disturbed individual having left him there to suffer. So, moving on, who are the potential suspects in relation to Josh's murder, if there are any? One specific suspect originated from a Reddit user who claimed to have known Joshua through high school. Apparently they went to the same school together and they were friends. So things like this often have to be taken with a pinch of salt, because we don't know who this person actually is. They are just someone who's posted on Reddit, so they could potentially just have a really cruel sense of humour and be posting false information, claiming to know a victim when they actually don't. However, there does appear to be more and more information to back up some of these persons' claims, if not all of them. This Reddit user claimed to have known a boy who he personally wasn't friends with in school, but he knew that Joshua was friends with while they were in school together, and he was listed essentially, or he was proposed as a suspect because of kind of a shady followings on. So after Josh's disappearance, there was a lot of issues in terms of potential murder charge. So this suspect goes by the name Andy, or his full name was Andrew Newman, who allegedly attended the same high school as Joshua, as I said, and they were friends. Andy specifically was friends with Joshua, and they were always acquaintances, but in the months leading up to his disappearance, they had reportedly gotten closer and closer. They were spending a lot more time together. The pair appeared to bond over their love of travelling and going on holidays, so much so that Andy had begun to, just before Josh's disappearance, tell everyone that he could, everyone that he knew, that they were planning a trip together. They were planning on going on holiday to New Mexico following their graduation from high school. And this, to some extent, was true, as Andy ended up travelling to New Mexico. While Andy was on this trip, he met a man who was working as a full-time carer for a physically disabled individual. Upon meeting this man, the two began engaging in an extreme abuse of recreational drugs, notably while the man was still in care of this individual. So he was still in his full-time carer position. So I'm not going to go into how wrong that is, but he was looking after this person, this vulnerable individual, and he was abusing these drugs. This carer had invited Andy back to the apartment of the individual that he was looking after. So I think he was like a live-in carer for this person, and if not, he spent a lot of time at this apartment. So he invited him back to sort of continue whatever they were doing of this individual. So the three of them were back at this person's apartment. And at some point during this encounter, Andy was left alone with the vulnerable disabled individual. When the carer had returned to the other two that he'd left alone, he discovered that the person who he was supposed to be in care of, who was extremely vulnerable, like I keep saying, had been stabbed to death. And obviously the first person of suspect had been the only other person in the room at the time, Andrew Newman. Andy had fled the apartment completely, but he was soon tracked down and arrested on suspicion of murdering this person. While being held in custody, Andy allegedly confessed to killing a woman previously and hiding her remains in a barrel. So this was ultimately confirmed that this woman had died and she was found in the barrel in the location that he'd said, but it was already a discovered set of remains. So someone had already been in custody, someone had already been convicted of murdering this woman, and they ultimately put it down to kind of like a cruel sense of humour of Andy's, that he had maybe read these details of this crime online and falsely confessed, a cruel hoax. So they didn't pin him to this particular murder, this previous murder that he'd confessed to. A few months later, Andy remained a free man due to lack of evidence. The carer of the murder victim actually lost his life in a bar fight, which was never confirmed to be linked to Andy, but a lot of people have speculated that he may have had something to do with that as well. So according to some people who claim to be relatively close to Joshua Maddux's case, a number of people did in fact attempt to alert the police of this friendship with this seemingly aggressive and murdering individual after they'd learnt of these crimes following Josh's disappearance. And apparently some people did see this connection, some people did see a bit of concern for their previous friendship before Josh just disappeared with this person who would end up murdering someone. However, local police appeared to just brush them off, saying this isn't really an avenue for investigation. They didn't really have any reason to believe that they were linked in any way, so it remained untouched in the initial investigation. According to some sources, some of Josh's friends received ominous and very concerning phone calls from who they believe was Andy. He'd say things over the phone to them like, "I put Joshua in a hole," which could obviously be put down to an extremely cruel joke and someone having an extremely disgusting sense of humour, but it does still seem like it would be worth investigating. I don't know. I really did try to find an update on Andrew Newman, whether he had received any form of sentencing or conviction for any of his crimes. I know that he hasn't been convicted or anything of Joshua Maddux's case because Joshua Maddux's murder still remains unsolved to this day. But if any of you know of Andrew Newman's conviction, if there was one, or if he's still a free man to this day, then let me know, because I couldn't find any official reliable reports online of whether he was convicted of any of the attacks that he claimed to be a part of. So yeah, as I said, Joshua Maddux's murder still remains unsolved to this day, and I'm not sure how well this came across, but I'm extremely baffled by this case, and if anything, I'm rather disgusted. I think it's awful, and I genuinely, my heart goes out to his family who have experienced so much loss in their lifetime. And Joshua Maddux seemed to be just such a loving and positive person, strong positive influence on everyone around him. It just seems awful that he met this cruel fate and no one has been taken to justice. So let me know what your thoughts are down below. There are a lot of ifs and buts with this case, a lot of potential scenarios. Some of them seem quite straightforward, but then I feel like anytime there seems to be a relatively straightforward theoretical scenario in this case, it can then start being picked apart by strange little details and factors that were discovered. So let me know what you think is the most plausible scenario down below. As I said, I am leaning towards someone else being involved just because it seems a very unlikely scenario if there wasn't at least one other person involved, but I don't really want to believe that there was someone else involved, you know? So yeah, let me know your thoughts down below. I'm always interested in reading your guys' discussions, as well as if you have any other specific case requests, please leave them down below. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you found this interesting, and I will see you guys very soon for another video. Thanks for watching. Bye.